everybody is going to be suffering in this recession, and workers are going to lose their jobs across the board. And in many cases, the job losses are going to compound the inflation problem, not only because you have fewer people productively employed, but because you're going to have the government trying to stimulate the economy with unemployment benefits and stimulus checks. And so we're going to have the same problem on steroids, where we have people not working but spending even more money. So upward pressure on prices will accelerate as stagflation gets worse.
Welcome back, rich followers. In this video, investor Peter Schiff discusses his views on why he thinks inflation will get worse and why he thinks a recession is imminent. We hope this video inspires you to get started on your dream. So please watch until the end. And if you are new here, consider subscribing so that you won't miss other educational videos like this. Let's get started.
The markets expect now the Fed to continue hiking rates, even though investors recognize that the economy already is in recession or believe that it soon will be in recession. So all the talk of the Powell pivot is suddenly taking a back seat. And the reason is you had a lot of FOMC members throwing cold water on the idea that the Fed is about to start pivoting. Nobody is worried about the economy. Nobody at the Fed seems to believe the economy is in recession, or at least they won't acknowledge that it's in recession. They're all on Team Biden, and they are towing the Democratic line. We have the strong economy. Just ignore what's happening with GDP. That's irrelevant. Inflation is the problem, and everybody is committed to bringing inflation back down to 2%, and everybody admits that the Fed is nowhere close to achieving those objectives. And I think it's those words that is causing people to rethink the idea of a pivot, or maybe push back the pivot further in time. And so that's why you're seeing both a backup in short-term rates and an inversion in the yield curve, because the markets recognize that regardless of what the Fed is saying about a strong economy, their fight against inflation will put this strong economy into recession if it's not already in recession. And in fact, if it is in a recession, the Fed is committed to making the recession worse in order to fight inflation. Now, what the markets still don't know, and that's why the yield curve is inverting and you're not seeing a bigger backup in long-term yields, is the markets assume the Fed is going to be successful in its fight against inflation, either because it succeeds on its own with the rate hikes, or the recession ends up doing the Fed's job for it. The Fed puts the economy in recession, and then it's the recession that kills inflation. So either way, the markets think inflation is going away, but the markets are wrong on both fronts. These rate hikes are not going to be sufficient to get rid of inflation. We still have negative interest rates, and the Fed isn't even going to come close to getting rates to neutral, let alone positive real rates that would be required to actually fight inflation. And at some point, the economy is going to be so weak that FOMC members are not going to be able to pretend that it's strong. They're not going to be able to shrug off all the evidence of a severe recession, and we are going to get the pivot. They're going to keep up the pretense and the bluff as long as they can, but ultimately, they're going to have to show their cards. They're going to pivot as best they can, and the markets are going to react, probably not the way most people think, but we will get a severe reaction in the foreign currency markets and in the gold market.
Peter then discusses how the Fed's commitment to reducing inflation is counterintuitive to the health of the American economy.
Also, one of the interesting things about all the Fed governors' commitment to reducing inflation is they're all committed to bringing the rate back down to 2%. Now, nobody is calling anybody out on the hypocrisy of this, because not too long ago, when the Fed first indicated that it would tolerate inflation above 2%, the reason it claimed it was willing to do that was because it now had a new goal of inflation averaging, meaning that instead of having a 2% target year over year, they now had a 2% average target, meaning that if you have several years of inflation below 2%, the Fed needs to have inflation above 2% to make up for that. Now, at the time when Powell announced this ridiculous target, I pointed out just how ridiculous it was by speaking about the very reason that the Fed had a 2% inflation target in the first place. The Fed initially told us that the reason they needed 2% inflation was to make sure there was enough distance between the inflation rate and zero, because apparently, according to the Fed, the worst thing that can happen is that prices come down. And so they needed to have a big enough buffer between zero and the inflation rate just to take out an insurance policy against falling prices. Well, if you had several years where inflation was below 2%, but still above zero, well, you dodged that bullet, supposedly. There's no reason to make up for some loss of inflation not being 2% in some future year by having inflation be above 2%. Just the fact that we didn't have deflation, prices rose, but they didn't fall, that's a win. Now we could go forward. It was nonsense to say we have to pay some kind of penalty. We have to make up for the fact that the cost of living didn't rise by enough in a particular year, that now we have to have an even greater increase in the cost of living in a later year. But I also pointed out at that time the exact position that the Fed is now in, that what happens if inflation really spikes up well above 2%? How do you average it back down to 2%? Well, that would require the Fed having many years of inflation below 2% in order to make up for those years that it's above 2%. Is anybody at the FOMC acknowledging the fact that we need to have inflation below 2% for a while to make up for 9% inflation? In fact, how many years is the inflation rate going to be well above 2%? And how many years would they have to get inflation below 2% in order for it to average 2%? In fact, if prices are already too high, making them go up by another 2% would just add insult to injury. Wouldn't it be good if we got some relief from these high prices? Would it be so terrible if after rising so much for a couple of years that prices dropped a little bit? Well, according to the Fed, no, it doesn't matter how much prices go up, they can never come down. They have to go up again no matter what. That supposedly is a victory over inflation. If we have maybe 10% inflation 2 or 3 years in a row, if the Fed could just make the fourth year 2%, somehow that's a victory. Forget about the huge increases before that. As long as they eventually get the increase to only be 2%, they've won. Now, nobody on the FOMC is talking about inflation averaging now. But what's more important is that no one in the media is holding anybody on the Fed accountable. Why not ask Powell? Why not at one of these press conferences? Oh, excuse me, Chair Powell, what happened to the concept of inflation averaging? You were talking about the need to have average inflation of 2% when it was below 2%. And so you said we needed to have inflation above 2% to kind of average out the years when it was below 2%. If that's the Fed's policy, why not stick to it? Don't we need to have many years below 2% to make up for all these years above 2%? Or is there really no policy? Are you just making this up as you go along? Is it heads the Fed wins, tails the country loses when it comes to inflation? We only want to average up low inflation, but we never want to average down high inflation.
Peter then talks about the myth that cutting jobs will decrease inflation because it will cause people to spend less money. Listen in.
And also on inflation, I'm hearing a lot more myths about inflation. And one of the big myths is the so-called trade-off that you have between inflation and employment and inflation and economic growth. A lot of people are saying that we need to have an increase in unemployment in order to have a reduction in inflation. This is the so-called Phillips curve, which believes that there's some kind of inverse relationship between the two. But this is false. It is Keynesian nonsense. Forcing people out of productive jobs does not fight inflation. The Keynesians are focused on demand. They think if people lose their jobs, they won't have any purchasing power. They won't be able to buy stuff, and so they'll have less demand, as if inflation is somehow a byproduct of people working and people spending their paychecks. It's not. Again, the public doesn't cause inflation. Workers don't cause inflation because they have jobs. And taking away their jobs won't take away inflation. In fact, if anything, having more people productively employed helps to reduce prices. Because when people are employed productively, they are increasing economic output. They are adding to supply. You have greater supply of goods and services, which reflect the output of people working. And when you have more supply, that puts downward pressure on prices. So even if the government is inflating the money supply, putting upward pressure on prices, the free market can offset that by increasing the supply of goods and services. But when people lose their jobs, the supply of goods and services is going to be reduced, and that is going to make inflation worse.
If you found value in this video, we would like to give you another video for you to enjoy next. We would highly appreciate it if you could like this video and share it with your friends on social media. Don't forget to subscribe if you are new here, so you won't miss another one of our videos. The more you learn, the more you earn.